Welcome to the Hello Flow podcast, a space where we bridge together professional success and career alignment with personal well-being. I'm your host, Casey Cunliffe. Join me in conversations around driving your career while also being mindful of your overall well-being. At a time when many people are awakening to their soul's purpose and navigating that messy but magical middle, I offer this space for personal and professional growth and alignment, and a place to ground and support you in your daily grind. After tuning into this podcast, I hope you receive the empowering counsel and actionable tools to usher in more ease and flow in your life, and equip you as you discover, develop, and evolve your Dharma. Now on to the episode. I am so excited to share this wisdom-filled conversation I had with a former colleague of mine, Dr. Mike Smith. He is an executive coach, founder of Huddle Advisory, former CFO and Chief Human Resources Officer in the sports and media space. And he just recently completed his doctoral degree in leadership and learning at Vanderbilt University. We cover so much in this episode, from leadership and self-awareness, what it means to be a leadership athlete, talent mobility within an organization, the power of relationships, how politics in an organization is not actually a bad thing, and how to drive your own career and create options for yourself as the CEO of your career. On this podcast, we talk a lot about the cross-section of career success and alignment and personal well-being. So I loved having this different type of conversation where I transport myself back to my former corporate life and talk about these same kind of topics around personal development and taking care of our health and well-being, but through the lens of how that looks like and applies when you work in a fast-paced, Type A, highly ambitious, top of their game talent, and results-oriented workplace. If you currently work in that type of work environment, this is the episode for you. Now on to the episode. I am so excited to have this next guest on the Hello Flow pod, Dr. Mike Smith. Welcome to the show.
Casey, so pumped to be here. It feels weird for you to actually call me Dr. Mike Smith, but excited to be here and can't wait to find our flow, or for you to give me flow, or for us to be in flow. What's the right way to think about that?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of ways we're going to approach it, and we'll find our own unique flow together.
Awesome.
For everyone listening and who isn't familiar, Mike and I were former colleagues and had long careers at the National Football League in the New York offices. I had 10 years at the league, or 10 Super Bowls. Mike, I think you had 16.
I
Um,
did.
we've had very similar paths in terms of role transitions and taking like big professional leaps and risks. So we're going to discuss that a little bit on the pod today. And I'd like to invite you, Mike, to share your journey, your career journey, and all the successes and lessons in between. So I'll pass it on to you.
Yeah, well, first, let me just make sure your audience knows how amazing you are and how talented you are. And there's no more evidence of that by the fact that we are now sort of at similar stations in life, having left corporate life to now coaching and solopreneurship. And you got to that answer 20 years or so before I did, which shows you just how much smarter you are than I am. But just by way of background, I'm a lifetime finance and HR person in sports and media. And I spent about the first 20 years or so, or 15 or so years of my life in finance before making the pivot to the talent and human resource space. And one of the first questions people generally ask me after sort of, can you get me Super Bowl tickets, or what it's like to work with Roger or the owners, is, how did a finance person end up making their way to HR? And I think the quick version of that is that, all during my finance career working with Deloitte or at NBC or even at the NFL, I always had this realization that I was this right brain thinker in a left brain world, that I always was much more energized and passionate around people and building teams and trying to advance agendas than I ever was around closing the books or uh, numbers in any way. Um, and one of the things that I think got me there is sort of just a healthy self-awareness that I always had, which I just think is a powerful strength for people that I'm sure we'll touch on more. Um, but I also really ended up seeing the value, I think, of diversity along the way without even actively thinking about it. I was always a person that ended up hiring around me for people that complemented my strengths. And diversity, people generally think about it as the visible differences we see in each other, but just as important oftentimes is the invisible differences that are not there. Sometimes that's formed by the visible, but sometimes it's not. So people that just had different skills or preferences or competencies than I did, I always hired around me, which has really fueled my growth. But at some point during my NFL career, after I'd been in finance there for a while, I ended up in a conversation with someone senior at the league, and we had just come out of a business plan meeting that was not really satisfying. It just sort of was a meeting that just could have gone better for a variety of reasons. And I ended up in a conversation with this leader, and the question was around just sort of culture. And the NFL league office at the time, this is sort of the late 2000s, did it really have a culture of innovation, or were people really just riding the laurels and the strengths that were inherent to the league? And one of the things that he put on me was, create a program around innovation that we think is going to, create a different culture in the league. That prompt turned into an employee recognition program called the Commissioners Awards, which you may remember, Casey, from your time there. And it was something where we created a league-wide program around the Rookie of the Year and the Employee of the Year, which was the Commissioner Award, and Teamwork of the Year and Innovation of the Year, and all these things. But for me, it gave me a real first row line of sight into all the human interest stories and all the little things that people were doing inside the league in order to contribute to its success, and a line of sight that I didn't have from my finance seat. So in finance, oftentimes people are numbers and everything is measured in an Excel spreadsheet. And having oversight of this program, the Commissioner's Award, really gave me insight into all the people that make the magic happen, that contribute to the lead success. And so that spurred in me just a thinking of, I probably am in the wrong line of work, and how do I get into the right line of work? So that sort of self-awareness combined then with a willingness to just embrace being uncomfortable, initiating a conversation with Joe Seclair, who was the CFO at the time, who I know is listening to this podcast, hopefully, with Robert Gulliver, the CHRO at the time, and ultimately the executive team, and Roger, the commissioner himself, around, can we create a role in the league that thought about people and culture in the same strategic way that we thought about selling tickets, which I know you were an expert in, or selling media rights, or even the game itself. And Roger, to his credit, was the person that had the final call, saying, Mike, I think this is the right decision for you and the right decision for the league. So I encourage you and support you jumping off a cliff and making this happen. And so that's how I ended up migrating from a career in finance to ultimately into the HR space. And I probably initially only thought it was going to be a temporary tour of duty, and then slingshot back into finance at some point. But once I got there, I realized I had found my home, and working with the leadership team there, and mentors like Troy Vincent on the football side, who really pointed me to look at the lessons of the game, and what goes on in the locker room for how to think about leadership and culture. And ultimately, that's what pointed me in the direction of coaching as being something that was so endemic to the sport of football, that's something that we should inject into the league office, and ultimately something that I found my own passion in around coaching leaders.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that story. And I totally feel just the organic and naturalness that you exude at being an executive coach, even just having a 30, 45-minute conversation with you, how well you can navigate that language, but also understanding how you can provide a lot of that, not just uplifting piece, but very strategic steps that someone can take towards their goals. And as you were speaking, when you mentioned the laurels piece, I do remember at the league, we would always say to not rest on our laurels because of how successful the brand is. And we see it year after year in terms of viewership, top 10 shows in the United States, and it's growing internationally, which is the last department that I left in, and wanting to grow the sport internationally. And didn't know that that's how you kind of shifted over from finance to HR. And it reminds me of when I moved from marketing. So I spent the first 2 years in marketing, and I went for a position within club business development. And when I eventually got that job, I was chosen to have sort of like a, I don't know what they called it with the commissioner, with Roger, but it was a handful of us that met with him. I think potentially high potential performers. And he had mentioned when he heard about me moving from marketing to club business development that he really likes those types of people that can get up, take a risk, go for what they want. And he'd rather have someone do that and quote unquote fail and learn from it and grow from it than someone that's not kind of stretching in that way. So it seems like even within the league, we shared a lot of commonalities in terms of our own career journey.
Yeah, it sure does. And it sounds, I think it speaks something to the league and it speaks something to other organizations that promote this type of talent mobility because when we were in the HR space, we used to have this expression that, careers are always employee driven and manager supported. There's a lot of people that may be listening to this podcast that will say, listen, my organization hasn't told me what the next move is, or I'm waiting for my boss to, point me in a direction. And I always tell people, everyone is a C-suite executive. You're the chief executive of yourself and of your own career. And it always starts with you of declaring what you want, why you want it. I think it's always healthy to make sure that it's also good for the organization so that there's an easy way to make an alignment happen. But at the end of the day, Casey, you made the moves because you initiated them. I made my moves because I initiated them. And we were just fortunate that we had bosses at the NFL and the environment at the NFL that allowed us to make those moves.
Yeah, and then I had made one more move from there. I left Club Business Development, which I was there for a little over 5 years. Loved working in the department, loved my boss, Bobby Gallo. Hope you're also listening to this episode. But he supported, even though he didn't want to lose me, he supported my move as I was starting to grow interest in the international world and wanted to stretch and build muscle in other areas as well. So, as you mentioned, the environment, but also who you work for and are they supportive as well is very important. I'd love to understand, you had mentioned the self-awareness piece when you moved over. You kind of talked about what that process is, but what did you do in terms of your own self-reflection to gain a greater understanding around what really was home for you and what really, excited you?
Well, I think none of these things are ever immediate. It's easy to look back now and feel like it was a straight line type of decision or a very clear answer that I landed on. But these things are always jagged lines and they're always an evolution as opposed to a revolution type of awareness. But I do think it starts with just talking to people and getting feedback and being open to feedback. In HR, we've got an expression, feedback is a gift. And my kids are sick of me actually using that expression around the house. But it starts with trying to hold a mirror up to yourself and really have as clear a sense of how people are perceiving you and how you're showing up and what your strengths are. And we know our strengths also sometimes can get in our way because we lean on them too much and they ultimately become a blind spot. So it's a conversation I often have with clients now around what are you doing to actually make sure that you are seeing the field clearly, to use sort of a football expression. You and I probably use a whole lot of sports metaphors in our work. And part of what I try to have people become more cognizant of is, are they seeing sort of what they want to see? Are they seeing only certain parts of the field, or seeing the entire field? And there's only one way to find out, oftentimes, is to talk people and ask questions and ask people for advice. And I think that was part of my journey, was really good mentors giving me feedback on ideas or things that I wanted to do, but also people telling me, very candidly when they've seen me at my best, and people telling me very, very candidly when they have seen me not really playing to my strengths. And so all those things pointed me towards HR, and then ultimately towards what I do now, coaching leaders and teams. But I also think it's a constant process of trying to learn and grow and see what's working, and experimenting with that, and then revising at that point. So it is never ending.
Yeah. And when you were mentioning feedback, I reflected on the times I got really specific feedback is when I was able to grow even further. Because, like you said, and the way I sort of think of it is, sometimes your greatest strength can be your greatest weakness. And how do you turn that around so you create that, you make sure your strength is your gift and not a weakness? So that's huge in professional development as well. So I'm wondering, how did you then take that and pivot, leaving the league and now becoming executive coach, and also pursuing your doctorates as well?
Yeah, well, I think to rewind the clock a little bit, and some of this now is probably a little bit fuzzy with time, and we had a pandemic and everything that's gone on between now. I left the league at the end of 2019, and it was just time for me after 16 seasons. I had done everything that I personally wanted to do. I was burnout. I also think it's healthy for organizations to actually have turnover at the top as well, because I saw it on the finance side when I left finance. An incredibly talented leader, Anthony Cardillo, took my role and is still there thriving. And I was blocking him on the finance side, and me leaving allowed him to really blossom even further than he was. And the same thing happened on the HR side, where now a whole new generation of leaders are thriving there. But when I left, one of the things that was the benefit of running HR at the time, we had launched an executive coaching program with a lot of our leaders, and initiated a lot of leadership development. So I had access to a lot of some of the world's best coaches, just by dint of running our programs there. And I got some great advice around, when I left the league, rather than just trying to jump into the next thing, really take some time. And so one of the things I did is I actually went out to Sedona, Arizona by myself, the first time I'd ever taken a vacation by myself, and just hiked and biked and did, Native American rituals, and sort of just really tried to just recenter myself for what my next step was. And it really did come back to coaching was going to be where I was going to be focused, because that one-to-one human relationship, trying to help guide someone from where they are to where they want to be, is where I got the most, personal satisfaction out of. What's interesting is coming to that realization right at the start of the global pandemic, is never a good time to start your own business, Casey. So I'll sort of pass along that tidbit to your listeners, that launching your own business during a pandemic is probably not a good time. But like most things, how do you find an opportunity in something that's a real disaster? And for me, what it led to is that I was talking to clients and pitching others around investing in talent and investing in coaching during that space, getting a whole lot of no's during that time, especially in the sports space, where the NFL and the leagues were just trying to get games on, understandably. One of the things I tripped on was a whole lot of academic research that pointed to organizations in times of crisis, during the dot-com bubble burst, or the financial crisis of '08, or any other financial crisis we can think of. Organizations that had the liquidity and wherewithal to actually invest in their people during those cycles emerged materially better than their peers on the other side, 3 and 5 years down the road. So the data was incredibly clear. And so during the summer of 2020, during COVID, it really struck me that as I was talking to clients about this research, I should really just, put my money where my mouth is and actually, take my own medicine and invest in myself. And so that's what led me to the idea of pursuing a doctoral degree. And I landed on a program at Vanderbilt, which is one of the preeminent education institutions in the world. It had a program that really was tailor-made for me, being a hybrid student, being remote and on campus. And it had three pillars to the program that just were totally integrated with what coaching work was for me and for other coaches, which is the three pillars were around how leaders lead, how people and organizations learn, and then how to use data and analytics to support the first two, which, with my finance background really spoke to me. And coaching at the end of the day is ultimately how you get a leader or a team to learn something new, a new way to behave or a new skill or a new way to interact with each other. And so for me, it started a 3-year journey of engaging with content, working with an amazingly talented cohort of fellow students. And ultimately, one of my colleagues that did the math, somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 hours of engaging with the material that I emerged on the other side, just fundamentally different. That summer of 2020, when I sat in my backyard with a beverage and thought about this idea, I knew it was going to change me, but I didn't really know how, because how could I? But I emerged on the other side, recently graduated, just a fundamentally different person. And I think one of the things I love is that I did so much writing during the last 3 years that what it really crystallized for me is the value of writing to just get really clear on your thinking, which is something I didn't really appreciate before. And the other benefit for me, spending thousands of hours on personal growth, is there's so many projects I just unpacked personal experiences I had at the NFL or NBC or just in my personal life and unpacked them around now being more distant, more removed, and through a much more objective lens, not totally objective, just more objective. And it allowed me just to see it much more clearly. And it just the having that kind of awareness and growth of how I showed up at the NFL and other places where I probably got in my own way by leaning on a strength too much, and where I was probably avoiding confronting something difficult or fighting the toughest fight I possibly could, and how that could have benefited me and the NFL and others around me. It was a real eye-opening experience that has allowed me to now take that and put it to best use with my clients, hopefully.
What a powerful, powerful reflection because, I've been doing something similar over the last couple of years as well through my own work. And to be able to say where I may have had blind spots, but then how can I also take my knowledge I have now and be in service to others so that others can also perform and be successful in where they're at. And I know you had mentioned to me about your trip to Sedona, and I love that advice about just instead of just constantly go, 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 because that's probably what you were at, especially where we had worked, it's nonstop, to just pause and sit with yourself. And that was probably the first time in a very long time. And I'm actually curious about the rituals that you did, because I feel like that's a little bit like something that I would be interested in, even the audience as well, because when we talk about self-awareness and really understanding, the audience is probably more familiar with like things like personality tests and assessments. We even would take it, I've taken it through that NFL lead program, like leadership assessments, but also some like metaphysical systems that can kind of tell you here's some like energetic gifts that you have. So I'm curious what came through to you when you took that time off.
The biggest thing for me is taking a breath and reevaluating where you are, what's important, and how you want to show up in service of others or to benefit others around you. I think there was one specific event that I went to where it was, the room it couldn't have been hotter. It was dripping sweat. I think it was to the point where I was actually, hallucinating a little bit and writing down intentions and writing down fears. And so it was just a very powerful moment that I remember just centering me that I had an obligation to myself and to at least those close to me to come back and just show up differently now that I've been given this gift of time and space. And it's funny, we both worked with incredibly driven executives, especially in the sports space in the NFL specifically. You don't get more talented, but also more type A, more results focused, and there's always more to be accomplished. And so many people we work with are incredibly fit, focused on their physical health. You're surrounded by former players or other people that are former D1 athletes or what have you. And everyone, from a personal health standpoint, gets the idea of the growth comes through the recovery. So you go through the training and you tear the muscle away, and then you take a step back and you grow, and the muscle builds back stronger by taking a breath and resting. No one thinks about their personal growth and development or their own work performance through that lens. And even the notion of, taking a full vacation or, really unplugging on weekends, or even spending dedicated time towards training their mind and their leadership skills or their people skills, or training having a real learning agenda that's structured the same way their gym time is structured. For me, that is something that's been an evolving learning for me, but it started with just taking a step back when I was done with the NFL and just thinking about, who I wanted to be and how I wanted to show up.
I agree with you 100%. And I think that's where I've also landed as well, because it's really easy to get caught up in that day-to-day results oriented, driven, what's next? We used to say, like, if someone asked us to jump, we would ask how high. And in addition to is how are you taking care of your mental and emotional health? I think that was a contributor to my chronic burnout. Was I was too much on that physical health and delivering in a lot of different ways, and then not kind of tending to things where I needed to recover in other ways as well. So it's so great to hear from someone that it was very successful in that corporate space and be able to step away and say, this is just as important, if not more, when we talk about our overall health as well. And not only for yourself, but you're also impacting those you lead as a leader as well.
I think so much of this is self-imposed or self-limiting thoughts. Like, I can't think of a leader I ever came across with at the NFL, NBC, or Deloitte that if I ever said to them, "Hey, I need to take a break, or I need to do this, or I need to do that," the times when somebody would, decline that, or, not sort of totally be supportive of something that I was looking for. I mean, I can't think of a person or a situation where that would have been the case. Oftentimes, we're our own worst enemies on these things. And so having just a conscious intent and really a conscious prioritization of what's important to you, where your limits are, and just making sure that's transparent to those around you so that it works within the context of a team or the context of what results or deadlines need to be achieved. I think there's always a balance that can be struck that will maximize everything.
Yeah, I think that's a great reminder for the audience listening, because the audience, for the most part, are very professionally driven, and burnout is probably the number one topic that I get asked about, that are the most listened to episodes on the podcast. And so it seems like there's still, even though there's an awareness of identifying your values and making sure that you're prioritizing your time against those, that people are still feeling burnt out and not sure if we can crack that formula, especially if you're in a certain part of your career where you're like wanting to hit overdrive and to accomplish your career goals. But I think it's always going to come back to making sure that, one, you are familiar with yourself and what your values and priorities are, but also being able to talk to others within your workspace and, coming up with that solution so that you don't get to the point where you're constantly feeling burnt out.
Some of this is, I think, our background in sports is a helpful lesson for us. One of the things I always talk about with clients is we should all think about it like ourselves as athletes. I sort of use the quote leadership athlete in sort of the way I talk about it, but just pick any generic athlete. And, if you're Tiger Woods or Serena Williams or Tom Brady or whoever, they view their training as being totally linked with how they perform on their field or on their court. And they see the linkage because they see the results when they train, they see their performance improve. But leaders oftentimes don't think that way. And general professionals generally don't think that way. They will if they get asked to go to a training or they are supposed to perform some type of professional development activity. Well, I don't have time now. I got to sort of fit it into my schedule at the end of the season, or I got to fit it in my schedule after this big project. And so I think to the more extent that our audience and you and I thought about ourselves as athletes, will end up ultimately performing better. And one of the things I always anchor on, and this is related tangentially to your burnout point, is one of my first questions with a client is, how you sleeping? Let's just talk about that, because I think sleep is so foundational to ultimately our exercise and our diet and our mental focus and our stress management and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And oftentimes if someone is not familiar with executive coaching or have had different types of executive coaches in the past, starting with sleep is oftentimes a pretty funny place for a lot of people, an uncomfortable place. But I would tell you, I don't know, 3/4 of my clients, the sleep habits and the sleep hygiene, pretty poor. And then if we can start making some movement on that, then all of a sudden everything starts getting a little bit better, and you start getting a little bit of a different perspective to actually manage the stress and the challenges and the balance that ultimately ends in burnout. And so we obviously want to try to head that way off in the past before someone feels that exhaustion.
Quality sleep is one of the main pillars of health. And when you start getting the quality of sleep that your body needs, that's where your mind, gains more clarity. So, yeah, something as simple as that. But as you said, when you're kind of in this environment of driving results, oftentimes we don't think about sleep because there's always something to get to. What kind of advice would you give others around career pivots and transitions, and how could you do those successfully within an organization, when you move industries, or even moving companies?
My opening starting point on that is you need to be having the right learning agenda and learning mindset so that you're the person creating options for yourself, as opposed to having to have change dictated upon you in a way that is not your choosing. And just to use a sports analogy, one of my favorite athletes, one of the world's best, Michael Jordan, of course, of Bulls and basketball fame, and he had this quote that I love and I lean on all the time that I think is applicable to this, is that, Jordan, one of the greatest athletes of all time physically, he said that my greatest skill was that I was coachable, I was a sponge and aggressive to learn. And one of the things that Michael Jordan did is that he knew that at some point his athleticism was not going to be at the same level relative to his competition, and that younger athletes would catch up to him, or other people would catch up to him. And so he developed a fadeaway jumper close to the basket in the post. If you're a basketball fan in the audience, and he developed that, as a way to actually extend his career, keep his dominance. And I just love that he had the self-awareness to develop a new skill before he had to. And he had this sort of killer combination of competitiveness and humility that really fueled his greatness. And I think that the question for your audience, if you're thinking about some type of career pivot, is, what's your fadeaway jumper that you're developing? And how do you develop that, months or years in advance, so that when you have a need or a door is open for you to use it, you can run through it, with full confidence. And so that's why a lot of times, starting to do things that you think ultimately are going to create options for yourself down the road are going to be really important. And I think then once you are developing some other talents, it really is helpful that you just be very clear and transparent with what you're looking for. Make an ask, because again, it goes back to this concept that everybody listening to this is the CEO of their career. So everyone has got a C-suite title, and your manager who is managing 10 other employees, or an HR department that is worrying about hundreds or thousands of employees, it's going to be very difficult for them to be perfectly lining up everything that everybody wants to be doing, or trying to connect dots, or think of these things in ways that are not incredibly straightforward. And so make it easy on people. Tell people what you want, why you want it, why it's good for the organization, and start a conversation from there. Again, be open to the fact that the timing might not work out right away, but just declaring sort of your ambition, declaring what you're looking for, is going to just have people view you in a new light, which I think is nothing but positive. And if you work in an organization where that type of dialogue is not viewed favorably, and your managers or the HR team are not supportive of that kind of conversation, then it's likely time for you to be starting to look elsewhere. Because I think talent mobility is such a strength of an organization. Again, it's got to be married up with strong performance, of course. I view that as table stakes, that someone that is not performing in their role or having other challenges, for them all of a sudden to declare they're looking and should be considered for an additional role, that probably isn't going to make as much sense. But if we view strong performance as table stakes in this conversation, then work some time to develop some skills, create options, and then declare what you want and why you want it.
I think you laid it out perfectly. It reminded me of the different pivots I made, not only within the NFL, but also in my previous organization, Macy's Corporate in San Francisco. They were the company who moved me to New York. And exactly, what you said in terms of making sure that you are performing and you're performing strongly in your current position, and then being able to create your own options. And I think part of that is also, I don't know if this is the right term, because I think sometimes people can use this term differently, but how are you networking? What are the relationships you're building, not just with mentors, but your peers as well? Because those are the people you are working with on a day-to-day basis and building initiatives and projects together, and being able to create that collegial environment as well. So I think that's another piece to it as well. And in my own reflection in terms of transitions and career pivots. Thanks for
Yeah.
sharing that.
No, and you said the important thing of the power of networking and the power of relationships. I mean, it's stating the obvious of how important relationships are. I think probably one other thing just to underscore that is how often we all make decisions and form inferences through emotions and other feelings and other experiences. So a strong relationship that Mike or Casey have with John or Sally, that's going to have them view us through a stronger, different lens than someone that just doesn't have that same relationship, even if the performances are relatively the same. So people may say that's unfair, and maybe that is unfair in some situations, but I think the important point is for people to prioritize networking, asking for advice, seeking mentors, having a personal board of directors, all the things that maybe people have read or have heard elsewhere, but how much that is a catalyst for internal moves within the building, or moves outside the building if it's a former boss or a current boss who can recommend you elsewhere. So can't stress that enough.
Yeah, I think that's actually a great segue into what you've studied in Vanderbilt, which I believe is around leadership, because we've been talking about driving your career and making career pivots. Now, how are you developing yourself as a strong leader? So, can you talk to us a little bit about what you've studied and what you've learned and what you're doing now?
Yeah, I think the Vanderbilt, I mentioned that there was three pillars to it: how leaders lead, how leaders and organizations learn, and then how you use data to underpin those. And as I reflect on, what's the major ahas that came out of it, I think it probably is through two lenses. The first is a more macro lens around how environment shapes everything in an organization. So, systems thinking, something that, the consultants like to use, this notion that the interconnectedness of culture and people and policies and structure and all those things is ultimately what drives performance. There was one of the things that I learned that I love is this management thinker from the 50s or 60s, this guy, Edward Deming, who was a big proponent of the quality movement in manufacturing. If the audience is familiar with like the Six Sigma movement and some of the things that were about quality, he had a couple quotes that I love, which is that every system is perfectly designed to get the result that it gets. So the reason that we're getting a result in an organization is because of all the other interconnectedness that's happening that within it. And he said a bad system will beat a good person every time. And oftentimes changing out the person is like the least of the issues with changing the ultimate results. The more senior the person, obviously that person can shape a new system, but oftentimes it's very easy to swap out John or Sally when really John or Sally are operating within some broader context of incentives and rules and other norms that are actually the ones that are enabling John or Sally to be perceived as not really performing. And for me, just having that sort of wide lens to organizational performance is helpful because that's something I work with clients all the time on now. We're both football people, and when coaches are reviewing film of a game, they've got this sky view called All 22, which is all 22 athletes, all how they're moving and who's doing what in relation to what other player. And I think it's fairly common for people to try to look through somebody else's eyes. So a quarterback to look through a linebacker's eyes, or a linebacker to look through a quarterback's eyes, to look through your adversary's eyes. But how often do we ever zoom out and really look at the all 22 video of what's going on? And I think the more that we try to elevate ourselves and look at it from above, and how one thing's influencing something else, which is influencing something else, will lead us to a better solution than just focusing on swapping out the quarterback or swapping out the linebacker. And I think that sort of all 22 video then I think fits hand in glove with politics that happens in every organization. And I don't know about you, Casey, or audience. When I worked at the NFL, I viewed politics as a four-letter word. I viewed it as unseemly, as distasteful. Why couldn't everyone just sort of operate in transparency and everyone sort of swim in the same direction? And I don't view it that way anymore. And I think what politics are healthy, they're necessary, and quite honestly, that's how organizations, whether it's the NFL, the NBC, or any organization, run, because you have a bunch of individuals, constituents with different incentives and interests trying to split up finite resources to achieve results. And politics is the way that decisions get made and resources are allocated in organizations. And that's something that I never fully appreciated when I was with the NFL, and now fully appreciate now that I work with leaders. And I would say, if I said 75% of my leaders, I end up having some type of sleep issue that I end up working with them on, I'd say probably more than a third, more than half, end up having political acumen and focusing more on the macro as being something also that we end up working on, because it is so crucial to how organizations achieve performance, is looking at that system level, the politics that are involved, and trying to shift things in a way that ultimately is shifting a system to get a better outcome. So that's sort of at the macro level is something that really spoke to me from the program. And then at the more individual level, there's all kinds of different leadership theories that have been promulgated by academics, from transformational to charismatic to transactional to you name it. The one I really landed on is this concept called relational leadership theory, which is all about the power of relationships, communication, and collaboration in order to achieve a result. And one of the anchor tools for a leader that is really skilled in relational leadership is the power of a conversation. And I think we both have seen, because you mentioned Bobby Gallo, a former boss. I've mentioned Joseph Clare, Robert Gulliver. The power of a leader to engage in just a real, honest conversation where they walked in really open to the possibilities that would emerge from that. I spoke to when I went from finance to HR, and when I went to see Roger for that final conversation. I'm not sure if Roger walked in expecting the result. I think Roger walked into that conversation just expecting to have an exchange of ideas and see what emerged on the other side of that. And when you go into something with that kind of open-mindedness, the possibilities that are going to emerge are limitless. For me, that it fits hand in glove with coaching because change happens through conversation, and just speaking with leaders and seeing them explore different concepts within a safe space, it allows us just to get to new options or new scenarios or new ways to experiment that we wouldn't emerge otherwise. So I think that for me, then, about the combination of the macro and the individual, which is really, really formative, and hopefully something I get to pay forward to my clients.
That's so fascinating. When you had mentioned politics, and even just the term can have a negative connotation when you talk about it, but the way you described it, it makes sense. And, in speaking to more of the senior executives, and when I remember with conversations, that is usually how they start off with, is what's going on at the macro level and how that's impacting what I am talking to them about. About this one initiative, or I'm trying to get this done, but there's like a couple blocks going on. Like, okay, what's kind of going on at that higher level? And that's interesting if someone is wanting to learn or isn't as aware. So if someone's trying to learn, okay, how do I understand that? How do I understand from an all 22 within my organization? What kind of advice would you give?
I think it always starts with talking to people. So there is ways to have conversations where people will view it as an open exchange of people trying to understand each other. They're one of the ways that people can navigate politics, especially in organizations where there's a lot of dotted lines or people might have less clear, strict roles and responsibilities, is how do you influence something without authority? For me, it starts with really understanding what their goals are, what their incentives are. How do you align incentives so that people feel like you're both on the same team and wanting the same things? It then moves into compromise. So rather than it being Casey's solution or Mike's solution, it's a joint solution where even if I don't really agree with everything that you're adding to this solution, I'm going to give a little bit because I know you're going to be more bought in if I allow you to help really cook this meal. And then once we're bought in, then we start building coalitions from there. Who are you close with? Who am I close with? That allows us to then go sell in something that we want to accomplish. But again, it all starts as a starting point of people can't be so locked in to what their own to-do list is and making sure they're getting their agenda fulfilled. It involves a genuine curiosity to go listen to others and find out what they're about, what's important to them, what their challenges are, and how you can help.
Yeah, I think that's also related to, I'd mentioned something that I wanted to talk to you about because I heard you talk about it on another podcast around authentic, in quotes, leadership. And to me, when we're talking about politics, I can see if someone's like, well, I don't want to play the political game. I'm going to come in and, be my authentic self. Can you talk about the balance of that? And I
Yeah.
know authenticity can be looked at in different ways.
As it relates to politics, you have people that are literally put their head in the sand and they don't want to engage in any political thinking at all. And they just want to come in, do their job. And for some parts of the organization, that could be fine. It's just that leading at scale or trying to operate at scale, that's not going to be sufficient. we also don't want someone to be, a political shark where they literally are stabbing people in the back or using information that is told in confidence to their advantage, or other things that maybe are more nefarious. I think there's a very healthy way to be attuned to the political dynamics, trying to form coalitions, always operating with integrity, and letting people know where you stand, but being mindful that the give and take and the negotiation that is involved in aligning resources is part of the game that you're in. And again, let's be clear, using another sports analogy, we're always in a game. So the question is, do you realize what game is being played around you? You mentioned authenticity, which is something that, quite honestly, I think came on my radar as being something to really think deeper about. Really, my first semester at Vanderbilt. So one of my first classes was around leadership theory, and they had us read a book by this woman, Hermania Ibarra. She's an academic from France, I think. I'm not exactly sure. And she had a book that's called Act Like a Leader, Think Like a Leader. I'd recommend it to anybody. It was a great book, and there's a lot in there, and there's actually a fair amount about networking in there to our earlier conversation. But one of the things that she said that I hadn't really thought about that really caused me to shift my perspective is this concept of what does being authentic really mean? Because a lot of people lean on it like a crutch that I'm my authentic self. I want an authentic leader. And I think people sometimes use that as a shield and as a way to actually not grow. Because if you define, what is authentic, what people in your audience think of, they might think, well, I'm true to myself. Okay. That's sort of just a generic definition. Well, what self? Your current self, your past self, the self you want to be. I mean, I sit here today. I've told you I'm a completely different person than I was before I started Vanderbilt, and certainly before I took a trip to Sedona, and certainly before I came in contact with the Commissioners Awards and got a real appreciation for the people in organizations. So, which authentic version of myself am I? Well, maybe it's my values. Well, my values when I was at the NFL probably was I'm not playing a political game. It's nasty, it's dirty, and I'm not gonna get involved. I'm just gonna do my job and try to, always just do the right thing. Now, with a little more reflection and thinking, I don't view politics as the same four-letter word like we've discussed. Well, maybe I just want to be sincere all the times, whether even if I'm growing, I just want to be sincere. Well, don't we always tailor our messages? Aren't we always trying to maximize our effectiveness in a way that we think our audience or the situation is ultimately going to be better served? Again, I'm not exactly sure how you reconcile, this learning mindset that we have been talking about and this notion of staying locked in of some static version of who you think authentic Mike or Casey is. And I just think by definition, learning is doing things and being uncomfortable and making mistakes with things that you're just not skilled at. And so by definition, you're moving yourself away from a version of yourself that you are today. And so again, I'm not even sure I've got a fully formed answer on this. The book a few years ago really just arose a question in me around what authenticity means. And is that a goal, or is the goal to try to constantly be creating a new version of your authentic self that is, learning and growing and getting you closer to, who you want to become?
Yeah, I think as you were talking, I was reflecting in terms of when you're saying, what does that mean to show up authentically? And we could spend an entire episode just talking about that because I think there's a lot of layers involved in terms of if someone feels safe to show up authentically in the workplace. But, something you had mentioned in a previous episode was, well, showing up authentically at home could look different than showing up authentically in the workplace. So it's more of in whatever space you're at, how are you showing up as your whole self that is appropriate for that space? And that's what's needed in that space and time as well. So I'm learning that now as I'm in my new chapter and showing up authentically in this space versus how I was showing up at the NFL and in more of a corporate space, and appreciate still being connected with you, Mike. So grateful to have worked with you in the capacity at the NFL and continuing to be connected in this new space that both of us are in as well.
I was gonna say thank you so much. I mean, this was terrific, and the learning is always mutual. Having a conversation with you, my eyes and ears are always you're wide open and sort of taking away something also. So hopefully your audience got something out of it.
Yeah. If anyone in the audience wants to connect with you, where can they find you and how can they contact you?
Yeah, I think if someone is just curious about their own learning or just wants to have a safe space to explore, you can find me on LinkedIn. It's probably the easiest place I've got a website, huddleadvisory.com, but you can access me either way.
Sounds great. I'll add that to the show notes. And thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Casey.
I am so grateful to have had this conversation with Mike. He has so much wisdom from his decades of experience, not only as a senior executive at big sports and media organizations like the NFL and NBC, but also how he's been able to step back now as an executive coach and consultant and an academic focused on leadership and learning. Through this recent experience, he has gained a deeper and broader all 22 perspective on how he views leadership, how effective leadership works within these types of organizations, and he came out a different person than who he was when he operated in the full-time executive capacity. I also appreciated the conversation as I reflect back on my own experience thus far as an executive and solopreneur. I feel like it really validated my own deep work I've been doing on myself the last few years around how growth and self-awareness goes hand in hand, reflecting on some of my strengths and how they also became blind spots in my corporate life. How I have leaned a lot into my own self-reflection and personal development to understand what caused chronic burnout on things that were within my control, like from an individual perspective. What I've learned from my experiences thus far, and how can I continue to refine not only my skills and talents, but also the way I can operate more effectively. Continuing to invest in myself through various learning and development avenues in order to continue to create options and optionality for my career journey, and how I view things differently now, like how to more effectively view the macro all 22 perspective, how to be more mindful of organizational politics in a way that is ethical and can be more beneficial for all, including yourself, those around you, and the organization as a whole. And what does it actually mean to show up authentically in different spaces? So I hope you got some really good nuggets from that conversation and appreciated it just as much as I had participating in it. I would love to hear how this episode resonated for you. Feel free to reach out to me through my website or Instagram. The links are in the show notes. And if you feel like this episode can provide some wisdom for anyone in your circle, I would be so grateful if you share it with your friends and family or post on your socials. Thank you again for joining me on the Hello Flow podcast. I'm your host, Casey Conless, signing off until next episode. Thank you so much for tuning into this week's episode. If there's anything that resonated with you, please share it on Instagram and tag me at CaseyCan_ and at HelloFlow Collective. I would love to hear from you. As always, if you enjoy listening to what we discuss on the podcast, please share the show with friends who may also resonate. And don't forget to also subscribe, rate, and review. See you next time on the Hello Flow podcast.